Our next guest is Democratic Senator Chris Coons. He serves on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, among many others, and joins us from Wilmington, Delaware. Senator, great to have you on. As noted, and as you've been following, a lot of news to get to you about. Let's start with the state of the war in Iran. The president earlier this week addressing the nation, saying that most of the U.S.'s objectives in this war have already been met, and he laid out a 2 to 3 week timeline for when he thinks the United States will be wrapping up. But yesterday, former Biden administration official Admiral John Kirby was on our network, and he warned that his worst case scenario would be the United States, quote, pulling the plug early, leaving the regime still in power to propagate terrorism. So how do you reconcile your own warnings of what you've described as a reckless war of choice with the real dangers that even some in your own party and the Biden administration have said would be extremely dangerous if we leave this war without accomplishing the degradation of this regime?
Look, Bianna, part of the challenge from the beginning of Trump's war of choice against Iran was the lack of clarity about his goals. Finally, after a month, he delivered an address to the nation. But honestly, after listening to his remarks on Wednesday night, I had no clearer sense of exactly what his priorities are, what our objectives are, and how he thinks they can be accomplished in 2 weeks. I'll agree with Admiral Kirby that the Iranian regime is a terrible regime, for decades engaged in killing Americans, in spreading terrorism throughout the region, and in threatening Israel and the United States with attack possibly someday with a nuclear weapon. So I in no way bemoan the passing of the Ayatollah. But what President Trump has done is to kick over a hornet's nest and to get the IRGC to use every tool they have, something they didn't do the 2 previous times that Trump ordered attacks on the senior leader of the IRGC, Qasem Soleimani, who was killed in his first term, or the attack on their uranium enrichment program last summer. By confusing means and ends, President Trump threatened at different times regime change, which hasn't happened, obviously. The Iranian people have not risen up and overthrown the theocratic regime in Tehran. He's threatened to end their military and has claimed that they've been obliterated. And now he has the additional problem of needing to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. For the average American, gas is now over $4 a gallon. There's no clear end in sight. And the Iranians have thousands and thousands of cheap and lethal Shahed drones, which they are firing all over the region, attacking oil and gas infrastructure, airports, our embassies, and our bases. So I think the president needs to be clear with us about how much cost he's expecting the average American to bear, how many more Americans may die in this ongoing war against Iran, and why he continues to say conflicting things about negotiating with a more reasonable and centrist government in Iran, which I think is untrue, and moving thousands of our most capable troops, Marines and the 82nd Airborne, into position to be ready to dramatically escalate the war. After Wednesday's address, I couldn't tell where President Trump's trying to take us.
Senator, there are over 1 million people in Lebanon who have been displaced by this war. At least 1,000 people have been killed so far. We know that hospitals are overwhelmed. There are blackouts. There's obviously infrastructure damage. And as somebody who I know cares deeply about the continent where I'm from, Africa, I'm sure you understand as well that the effects of this war are being felt as far away as Africa as well, just in terms of rising food prices, the rising cost of oil, which obviously increases transportation costs. The fact that you have humanitarian cargo and also fertilizer passing through the Strait of Hormuz, that is also a massive problem. So as we debate, the strategy of the Trump administration and whether there's going to be a regime change or not, how do we ensure that civilian suffering does not become invisible here?
Thank you for the question, Zain. And as you well know, about a third of the world's fertilizer passes through the Strait of Hormuz. And this is a critical time for the strait to be closed. I was just at a farm here in Delaware yesterday, and it's planting season. If farmers don't get fertilizer on their fields and their crops growing in the next couple of weeks across the major countries of Africa and the Middle East region, we're going to face another round of famine. This could be a bigger humanitarian disruption than we saw at the beginning of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, when, as you'll remember, the loss of the access to both grain ships and fertilizer coming out of the Black Sea caused huge disruptions for dozens of countries around the world. The collateral damage of this war of choice is going to be enormous. And President Trump just sent to Congress a request for a budget that would dramatically increase how much we spend on defense and cut how much we spend on child care, Medicare, Medicaid. So here in the United States, President Trump is doubling down on what I think was a mistake last year of ending USAID, dramatically cutting our support for humanitarian causes, feeding the hungry around the world. He now wants the average American to also bear the added cost of cutting, closing down, or shifting to states the social programs that help keep us healthy, help feed our children, and help us be respected around the world.
Yeah, we'll get to the historic $1.5 trillion defense budget that the White House has asked for just this morning in a moment. But I do want to ask you about another issue that has risen once again, and that is concern over the unity of NATO here, given the president repeatedly stressing his frustration with NATO for what he calls the lapse on their part for not joining the United States in its war here with Iran and threatening to leave NATO. You, alongside Senator McConnell, have written a harsh statement and an important statement to remind members of Congress and the United States as a whole that NATO allies bled alongside the United States servicemen and women after 9/11. Given your statement, is the Senate prepared to pass binding legislation to block a unilateral withdrawal?
Well, Bianna, strikingly, we've already done that. And it was then Senator Marco Rubio who joined with Senator Tim Kaine in leading an amendment to the Annual Defense Authorization Act now 2 years ago. The NATO treaty did not have a clause that barred a U.S. president from unilaterally withdrawing because we never imagined that that would happen. But given Trump's threats to withdraw from NATO during his first term, 2 years ago, Congress came together and passed an amendment to the statute that says a president cannot unilaterally withdraw from NATO. It requires an affirmative vote of Congress. And part of the point that Senator McConnell and I were making is that NATO continues to enjoy bipartisan support in the Senate because it has contributed to our security. Look, one of the confounding things about President Trump is that he doesn't take credit for some of the things he's accomplished. Last year, he pushed and berated NATO into stepping up and contributing dramatically more to our collective security. Not 2% of their GDP, but 3.5%. And our European allies have taken on the tens of billions of dollars of cost of buying weapons for Ukraine to defend themselves. And in this current moment, Trump's doing incredible things. He's lifted the sanctions on Russia's sale of oil and Iran's sale of oil so that Iran and Russia are making more money. And President Zelensky of Ukraine has visited our allies in the Gulf and is offering them assistance with defending them against Iranian drones, something that we should be supporting. President Trump has our partnerships and our alliances all backwards. He misunderstands how NATO works and why it's brought value to the United States. He did not consult with them before starting this war and is now blaming them for not joining us in a war he never consulted with them about. It's dizzying. And last, to go back to your first point, Secretary Hegseth just fired a 4-star general in the middle of a war who is a respected combat veteran with decades of service. And here on the eve of Easter, on Good Friday, he also fired, for the first time in history, the leading Army chaplain. It is striking that Secretary Hegseth, at President Trump's direction, has fired dozens of senior generals and admirals. That does not make us more safe, and it does not provide the confidence within the ranks of our armed forces and the confidence among the American people that we should be looking for in a time of war and in a time of global rising risk.
Senator, you said many times that this is clearly a war of choice. And yes, of course, I mean, a lot of Democrats believe that the president should not have entered this war in the first place. But now that the US is in this war, I mean, there are, at least from my perspective, no sort of good, clean options in terms of how to end this war. There's only sort of less bad ones. If you were going to advise the president on the best way to exit this war in a clean way, and the best way to sort of find a clean off-ramp to this war, and you've got to bear in mind deterrence, you've got to bear in mind America's credibility and how you end this war would mean for that. What do you think is the best way to end this war responsibly, Senator, at this point?
First, engage with our allies. Instead of berating them, belittling them, threatening them, the countries that have minesweepers, the actual ships that are capable of clearing the Strait of Hormuz from the naval mines that Iran is still readily able to put in the straits and close them down, it's our NATO allies who have minesweepers. The Trump administration pulled the last 4 American minesweepers out of the Persian Gulf just a month before the war started. So begin by working with our allies. Embrace Ukraine's offer of the world's best defenses against drones. Partner with the countries like the Emirates, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, in coming up with a common objective to reopen the strait and to continue the pressure campaign against Iran. Find a pathway forward that will de-escalate the daily exchange of drones and missiles, allow us to rearm, and put sustained pressure on Iran by choking off their ability to export oil, not by seizing Karg Island, an expensive and risky operation, but by blockading Iran using U.S. military and naval forces and allied naval forces, prevent Iran from shipping its oil to the world markets, and reopen the Strait of Hormuz to our allied partners in the Persian Gulf.
So quickly, Senator, before we let you go, given your concerns about the state of the war and how it's being conducted here, in addition to concerns about what looks like politically motivated purges by the Secretary of Defense, should Democrats on the Appropriations Committee approve this budget request?
It's very unlikely that we will approve this budget request given the cuts to critically needed domestic programs and the dramatic increase. Look, my sources suggest the Pentagon had no plans to request another $500 billion, that this number really was picked out of thin air by President Trump, who tweeted it out because it sounded tough and big. I don't believe they can spend another $500 billion in the coming year, and there's a number of areas like the Golden Dome program which are ill-defined and ill-considered. We should be providing a raise to the men and women of our armed forces. We should be replenishing our stockpiles of critically needed munitions. And there are programs that I have voted to increase our investment in and would do so again. But an increase of this size, with cuts to domestic programs and without support to our vital allies like Ukraine, our partner in fighting for freedom in Europe, I won't support that at all.
So you're a no on this. Senator Chris Coons,
Always
thank
good
you
to see
so
you.
much
Thank
for taking
you,
the time.
Senator.
Thank
and
you.
Happy holidays to you.